if there's data that shows your audience is on that channel and is spending a lot of time there, then you should invest in YouTube. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus on video podcasts, but I think it's going to be, or I hope it's going to be more strategically minded versus just sort of something that's automatic or a box that needs to be filled.
One of the biggest mistakes I see businesses make with podcasts, it's treating it like a hobby instead of the marketing channel that it is. They focus on producing episodes instead of producing results. But the truth is that companies get the biggest results from podcasting when they aren't just recording conversations. They're building entire marketing engines with it. And then in this conversation, I sit down with Roger Nairn. Now, Roger is the founder of JAR Podcast Solutions, a legend in the space. We dig into how podcasting has evolved over the last decade. Roger's helped major brands create, market, and measure podcasts that actually move their business metrics. And what he shares is a powerful reminder. The goal is not downloads, it's influence. You'll hear why the smartest brands today start by asking, what job does this podcast need to do? Now, is it building authority, influencing pipeline, attracting talent, or deepening relationships with a niche audience? Because when you start with the right strategic question, every interview, every episode, and every piece of content becomes something bigger, a part of something bigger. So as you listen today, think about this. How could your podcast interviews, either as a guest or a host, become the spine of your content marketing system and help you build trust with the exact audience you want to serve? Let's get into it. Roger, you and I have both been around the industry for over a decade now, and I'm so excited to talk with you about, where we've come from, where we're going, and what it means for business. So can you just sort of give a background on where, your history behind this? Bring people up to speed on who you are and why they should listen to your voice.
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on the show. So I'm Roger Nairn. I started JAR Podcast Solutions along with my partner, Jen, coming up 10 years ago. At the time, I was working in the advertising industry. I worked for big agencies, and I was always on the client service side. I love the advertising world. However, at the time, I started to fall out of love with the actual advertising. This was around the time when programmatic started to really take off, and things were just not as exciting as I originally liked them to be. My partner Jen, on the other hand, came from the creative world. She's very much a writer, journalist. She worked with the CBC for many years, and so when we joined forces together, we started to see something interesting going on in the podcast world, which is that brands were getting involved. However, I saw that they weren't really performing. They weren't doing what they needed to be doing from a business perspective. Jen saw them not really taking advantage of podcasts for what they can be from a creative perspective. When we created JAR, that's really what we meant to be doing. Fast forward now, 10 years later, we're a team of 16. Often there's about 25 of us with contractors. And we make, market, and measure video and audio podcasts for some of the world's biggest brands.
And it's interesting. We both started out a decade ago, and you'd give your elevator pitch, and people, the first question would be, what's a podcast?
Exactly.
Right? And now it's gone full stream where it's almost part of a marketing suite has
Absolutely.
To include that. So Can you explain how people are using that today? Not just for the ego thing of I've got a podcast, but actually using it as a central part of their marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Originally I would jump on a sales call and really need to teach people about, what a podcast can do for their brand. Now brands are using them for authority building trust, engagement with a specific audience, could be, thought leadership, it could be building, pipeline influence, really audience depth, talent attraction. A lot of big brands are using it to hire some of the best people and really showcasing their culture or building community. I mean, there's really a massive amount that can be done with podcasts these days.
It is amazing that it's a tool and you can use it for various things, right? And I'd always say, guesting or hosting, I don't think it's an either or. I think there's different goals for that. But yeah, it's the same way on guesting, right? I worked
Absolutely.
with probably a Fortune 100 military defense company. And they like, we've got all the clients we need, but what we need is talent, right? We want to make sure that the best and brightest engineers want to come to us and not go just to Google and Microsoft, right?
Yeah.
So it's really starting with that idea of what do you want from it? Not just necessarily, I want a podcast. It's the
Mhm.
results that come from that.
And if you're that defense contractor, I'm sure they've got a lovely website, and I'm sure it has, video on it and all sorts of flashing things. But, there's something really special about audio and now, video. Mostly though with audio is just the intimate nature of it. I mean, as we're talking right now, I'm literally whispering in your ears and you're whispering in my ears. And I'm taking a moment to really absorb what it is that you're saying. And it's not something that's broadcast across the world necessarily. It's something that I've chosen to sit down and enjoy, on my personal time. And so if you can do a good job of making that connection with your audience member, whether it's through that great host or whether it's obviously through great content, there's a lot of trust that can be built there. And the agency Edelman just came out with the Edelman Trust Barometer, and pretty much every major institution in the world is decreasing when it comes to people's perception of them and specifically trust, except for business. And specifically, employees are now seeing their employer or business as being one of the more trusted institutions.
It's interesting because it's for so long people were talking about attention, right? How do I get heard? How do I break through the noise? And now with, AI, content is free and plentiful. It's not so much how do I make noise, but how do I build that trust? How do I get that authority?
Absolutely.
So, and as you said, everybody that listens to you, has opted in. You get 100% opt-in rate for every podcast.
Exactly.
So how is the agency world changing for that? I mean, what you were doing 10 years ago was breaking, uh, and now 10 years later, you're still at the forefront with that. So what does that look
Yeah.
like now, and where do you think that's going?
Well, it's really interesting. We, I think, are needing to shift to what the more traditional creative agency models have started to do. And when you think about the old agency models, it was hourly billing, really bloated teams, a lot of like kind of what I would call like creative theater, presenting in really flashy ways. And the reality is, clients don't want that. They want traction. They want their business to grow. I mean, if you're a CMO, you have one mandate. You got multiple mandates, but the largest one is grow the business. And so agencies, I think, that are winning now, and we're one of them, and are very much all in on this sort of model, are moving from we produce episodes, which is very much kind of a vendor mindset, to we move brand and business metrics for you, and we are now your partner. And that's a really important shift. That's, it's very much more about influence over downloads. It's more about, um, creating marketing engines instead of episodes, performance over production. And so when we talk about our agency and the role that we play, we we very much have a job that needs to be done for each individual one of our clients, and it's always different. It could be authority building, it could be pipeline influence, it could be audience depth, like I said, but we never want to be in that position of just a vendor.
And I love how, nobody wants, well, I shouldn't say nobody, right? If you just want a podcast, if you just want a podcast interview, that that's an activity, right? And so
Mhm.
many people are spending a lot of money on hobbies and calling them marketing and then getting upset when they don't work. I love how you say, the CEO's role is to grow the business. And
Mhm.
I heard somebody refer to that as growing the value of the business,
Absolutely.
right? And it's just not one metric. It's the overall value of the business and really setting that apart. So it sounds to me like, 10 years ago, it was the production. Today, it's more the strategy. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it's I mean, you have to have both, because I mean, it's the common challenge that marketers have always faced. It's, you need to focus on the business side of this, because if it's not driving sales, or if it's not increasing brand authority, or if it's not, increasing brand perception, then there's no point in doing it. However, you're never going to get there unless it's a great creative product. So you have to find that balance between the two, and that's constantly our challenge. And I would argue that that's the same challenge no matter what sort of deliverable you have. In your case, you're getting people on podcasts, and you're helping build that authority, but you also and you do that in a very strategic minded, creative way, but you also have to perform. It has to succeed.
Yeah, and it's at the end of the day, it's all about the performance. And unless you know that goal that you're going for, it's hard to hit that.
Yeah.
So, how do you deal with this idea that, well, there's got to be metrics for everything? I believe that Google, Facebook, whatever, has taught the market that everything can be measured and quantified. And what's your sense on that?
That's a great question. My sense is that, in 90% of the times, that is important, because you do need to understand sort of where you are in your, where you are in meeting your objectives. However, it can't be at the expense of forgetting the creative product, and making it just a numbers game. And that's the beautiful thing about, creative products in marketing, is that it's always been kind of the rock and roll of the business world. And that's for a very good reason, because it needs to, again, balance the two, the business side and the creative side. And so it's important to apply those, it's important to track those metrics, and establish what the KPIs are. But you're never going to get there, and you're never going to hit them unless you have a great creative product. And so for us, that involves hiring the right people, giving ourselves enough time to develop the creative idea for the show itself, giving ourselves enough time for proper editing, and you know giving, we always talk about sort of adding as much sort of breath into the process as possible, and not bogging ourselves down with too much process. But also, the beautiful thing about podcasts, or one of many beautiful things about podcasts, is the amount of data that every single one of these episodes sheds. And from a business perspective, it's so important to know, like, who are we reaching? How long are they listening for? How long are they watching for? What part of the world are they from? Age, sex, location, household income, education level. We can track this all these days. And then also on the creative side, where are they skipping? Where are they dropping off on the episodes? That's all really, really important information, which we can then feed into our creative team to evolve the show and help it grow. It's the equivalent of creating, TikTok videos, but not really looking at the numbers and metrics behind them. If you just start posting the next one and the next one without really learning from how the previous one has done, you're really doing yourself a disservice. And we look at it the same way with podcasts.
I think of, we used to have a phrase from the Navy called doubling down on stupid, right? So if it's not working, just doing more of it won't do that. So, I always think of that, we've all got opinions, right?
Yeah.
I've got an opinion about my business. I could hire an accountant or a
Hmm.
consultant that has an opinion on my business. And It's the customers that have the real knowledge, right? They're voting with their time and their money, and they'll tell you what they love and what they loathe. And it's this idea of let's double down on what they love and stop doing what they loathe.
Of
And
course.
now the data exists because, when we started out 10 years ago, I think it was more podcast guessing. It's not explicit. I always love Rand Fishkin
Mm.
lives up near you, and
Hmm.
I admire Rand, and he always gives that example that he's out speaking someplace, and somebody hears him. They go to the website, they spell his name wrong, but Google gets them there, and Google says, "We brought you this traffic."
Hmm.
Then they get confused, they get distracted, they leave, but the retargeting from Facebook brings them back, and then they buy. And Facebook's going to say, "We brought you that." Now, was it Google? Was it Facebook? Well, if you believe it's all got to be 100% attributed, then you shouldn't do podcasts. You shouldn't do podcast interviews. You shouldn't do public speaking because there is some serendipity to that also.
For sure. Yeah. It's a constant, there is a lot of serendipity in that, for sure. I was just thinking also about the sort of question around data and looking, and how much, emphasis do you put on the numbers. I think the one piece, when I think about how agencies are needing to evolve over time, the one piece that we've really had to invest a lot of time and energy into is, if we're going to be seen as a performance partner, then we really need to understand our client's business more. And I think a lot of creative agencies, a lot of podcast agencies, and got themselves into that vendor position because they're just cracking along and pounding out episodes without really understanding their business and what exactly this is doing for the business. So we talk internally a lot about sort of business literacy, and that comes from, that includes everything from, what do we need to do to get the project through legal? We work with a lot of pharmaceutical brands. Like, we need to understand compliance. Procurement always gets involved. We need to understand what are the reporting expectations of these, of this organization. We're not just going to take a performance package off the shelf and report, kind of the way we always want to do it. We want to be able to slot ourselves into the decks that are being presented on a weekly basis with our clients. And so if we can walk the walk and talk the talk with these big brands, we are seen as more of a partner.
And that's the thing. There's a difference between a hobby podcast, right, where you just get together and you talk and you have conversations, right? You edit it yourself, and whatever happens. And there's a difference between that and doing it as a business asset. And I think when people start to merge those two together, that's when that business asset, all of a sudden, that they were so excited about for a quarter, that next quarter becomes an embarrassment with that. And can you talk a little bit about, there's a fact in podcasting that the average podcast, 80% of podcasts die within the first 10 episodes.
Mm-hmm.
So often I tell people, if they're starting a podcast, if it's for your brand, wow, think through it. And I think that's where an agency partner, somebody with experience, can help them think through it, of what's the first year going to look like. How do you think about that when you talk with clients early on?
Yeah, oftentimes we'll talk about the first year as being the learning year. We are gathering over the course of 10, 12 episodes as much information as possible. That can be data, or that can be just project expectations and understanding of how best to develop and how best to produce the show, because you have to think about the actual day-to-day production. How much lead time do we need to have our guests prepared, and if we're going to ship them equipment, what does that look like? And so we treat the first year as a learning year. Not to say that the show isn't still going to perform and do great things for the brand, but a podcast is a longer term investment, and you need to treat it like a channel versus just a one-off kind of campaign. Because if you do it that way, two things are going to happen. One is the show is going to perform better, and you're going to have a stronger relationship with your audience, and they're going to reward you with, more love for the brand. But the second thing that's going to happen is, and we haven't talked about this, is like that podcast is or can be the spine of your entire content marketing system. And you need to learn what's going to work best for you over the course of that season on how best to utilize the show, because every episode's gonna, you're gonna get a transcript, and you can turn that transcript into blog posts or newsletter articles or white papers. You're gonna get clips, and you can turn those clips into obviously social content. So, or maybe some of our clients use their materials in their annual reports with QR codes, and they'll create little landing pages. There's really first of all, there's no rules as to how you can use the content, but also that, it's whatever your mind can come up with as far as how best to utilize it. And so usually it takes about a year to establish a really good system. And then everything on top of that is just building upon success and constant, a podcast is a living, breathing thing. So you can be looking over the course of that year on what's working and what isn't, and making revisions and improvements as you go.
Do you think that's sort of a litmus test there? If you won't commit to it for a year, it's probably not worth starting with.
I want to say yes with an asterisk attached to it,
Okay.
because I do think that there can be uses for sort of shorter term, in some cases even like campaign type material. And I'll give you a perfect example that we're seeing a lot of is companion podcasts with different shows or movies that we see coming out of Netflix or Disney. And I think in those cases, there can be a long-term shelf life for those shows. However, as you know, in the entertainment world, some of those movies or series are only really in the public's eye for a certain period of time. And if we, and if they want to create a companion podcast where you have this documentary subject, and if you want people to learn more, they can go to this 6 parts or series. Well, now we can talk forever about, like, is that considered a podcast or not? I think that's, we can argue about that forever, and I don't even necessarily have an answer for that. However, I do think that there is sort of that short-term viability of it, but for the most part, it is a long-term game.
Okay, I can see that because I've seen companion ones that go with books, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
they'll launch the book, and if there's 12 chapters, they might have a podcast for each chapter. I love that
Love that.
idea. Just as sort of the same way for podcast guesting, right? Are you just doing it
For
for
sure.
what we call a guest storm to launch a book, or is it a long-term brand builder there?
Now, I would argue that, in that case of the books, I think that the authors that are treating that like the authors that are looking at that strategically, like, yes, we're going to treat that first season as just talking about the book because we're in sort of launch mode. However, if you're Malcolm Gladwell, you've got, what is it, a year and a half, 2 years in between books, 3 years in some cases. It's really great to continue that podcast. Maybe you're hitting on different topics, or maybe you're using the podcast to explore your future writing. But it's a way to kind of keep the engagement relationship going in between books, or in between seasons, or in between, fill in the blank. I love it when podcaster, you see Mel Robbins is just killing it right now. She does a great job of that. But then obviously when let them is the big focus, she puts a big focus of that on in the show as well.
But the entire podcast is her structure, right? Every lesson is sort of put that in the Mel Robbins structure, and you're reminded of that. That's a great example of how a podcast supports a book and a book supports a podcast. So as people are looking for help with this, agency partners, what are the type of questions they should be asking? Because we often get asked, hey, can you help me do my podcast? And I always think of, there's a lot of things in life you can do, but doesn't mean you should do them or that you're doing them well. And I always say, that is not our zone of genius. Let me introduce you to people. So what should people be looking for in that?
Yeah, I think the biggest question you need to ask is, what is the job that this podcast needs to be doing? And what I mean by that is, you know, does it need to be building category authority, or does it need to be supporting demand gen? Do you need to be attracting, new talent? I really want to cautious brands that want to just get into podcasts because it seems like the cool thing to do, and instead look at it as a proper um, piece of marketing content that's gonna serve a purpose. And so, what is the purpose behind the brand? What is the job that the podcast needs to do? The second thing you need to be very clear on is, who is the audience for this show? And unfortunately, you can't use the audience as everyone answer anymore, because there's just so many podcasts out there. So you really want to slice and dice and get to the bottom of, who exactly is this show for? And then sort of the third thing is the results that you're looking for. What is success going to look like? I think we're well past the point where, in fact, I once had a client say to me, and at a very, very, very large company, in the CEO's boardroom, in fact, I asked the question, what does success look like for this podcast? And they paused and said, honestly, just doing it is going to be success for us. Just getting it out there is, like, I'll be shocked if that goes, if that actually happens. And first of all, I was kind of like, well, do we want to work with you if you're shocked that this thing actually happens? Like, it's going to happen. Like, that's what you're hiring us for. But, as far as like KPIs, it was just that simple, right? Now you need to, what does success look like at the end of this first season, at the end of the second season? How can you walk up to your CMO's desk and say, boom, I need budget for this for next season, because look at the performance of it. Look at what it's done for the brand. And then finally, the fourth thing is, like, what do you look for in a partner? Like, what do you look for in a relationship with, with an expert, whether that's in podcast production or audience growth? Like, what do you want to get out of this relationship, and how do you want to feel, working together?
It's I heard somebody refer to it as rap, right? Random acts of podcasting, right?
Exactly.
Rap is crap. Just throwing stuff at the wall. That's not how businesses do it. And I think there's that life cycle stage where everybody just wanted to get on, you name the new platform. There's that initial thing of coming in and this is fun, but with every marketing channel, every marketing expense, you're going to have to come back and say, did it get an ROI? What did we learn? And how do we justify doing this more? Right.
Yeah.
And so from that standpoint, don't do rap.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, let's be honest, there's going to be, the next big thing is right around the corner, and we all want to, play with it and test it and see if it works, but we don't necessarily want to, we don't necessarily need to be always all in on every new thing. Otherwise, I think there's a reason why CMOs only last an average of 4 years in their role, because they get so burnt out with the organization switching gears and all that sort of stuff. We need to stop switching gears.
Well, you put it out there, right, with the next new thing that's coming in. Where do you see podcasting going here, right? Here, as we're talking, what was that, a couple of weeks ago, Apple just came out and said, oh, yeah, we're supporting video now on podcasts. So where do you see this going?
Yeah, I mean, we're all in on video, on YouTube specific. In fact, we've just rolled out a very clear, YouTube expertise. We've actually built up a team specifically focused on YouTube, because I think, and I think, sort of to answer your question, I do think it is more video. However, I think it's more strategic video. Podcasting on YouTube shouldn't be an automatic thing. I think we've watched the last year and a half, 2 years, where everyone has just thought that it's, an automatic thing. And if I look at our industry, just, podcast agencies, I think often, these audio producers, bless their hearts, are now, wearing a dozen different hats, because they're now video editors and they're video producers, and that's not what they love or we're hired for or have expertise in. We've all now just assumed that we have to, slap a video on our podcast recordings and throw it on YouTube, and they're just not performing. Like, they're just not performing at all. So what, we're looking at it from the standpoint of, if it makes sense to invest in that channel, if there's data that shows your audience is on that channel and is spending a lot of time there, then you should invest in YouTube. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus on video podcasts, but I think it's going to be, or I hope it's going to be, more strategically minded versus just sort of something that's automatic, or a box that needs to be filled. I think we're going to see a lot more niche podcasts, really, really, smaller audiences and content that's custom created for them. We once did a podcast for the Port of Vancouver, which was all about logistics, and that sounds boring, but actually, when you think about every single little moving thing that has to happen in order for, that container ship to, dock, and then that container to end up on a train, and then on a truck, and then it's actually quite fascinating. However, their audience was only, I think the actual end number was like 250 people, and they were all executives that operate within the port. I think examples like that we're going to see more of, where it's just tailored content for that specific audience versus kind of thinking about it more broadly. And then finally, I think, from a analytics standpoint, we're going to see just hopefully a lot more data. I think the question that, we don't have all the plumbing connected to one another when it comes to YouTube, for example, and some of the different measurement tools the third-party measurement tools. I think we need to do a better job of kind of connecting into YouTube in that respect. And I'm very, very excited about the future. And I think part of that is also just the quality bars getting higher and higher. And I think we'll start to see some of the, what did you call rap?
Random
Random acts of podcasting. I think we'll start to see some of that fade away, because people realize that it's a lot of work, and if they're not seeing any results, then they'll, kind of move on to the next thing. So I think the quality bar is going to continue to go up.
So, because podcasting is a channel, right? And we've seen it grow so much in the last 10 years and refine itself. And I honestly believe that today it's more powerful than it ever has been, both from the people that are listening to it. There's that proof of life. So many things I get through marketing now, it's like, is this AI generated? Somebody listens to us, they're like, no, that's actually Roger and Tom talking.
Yeah.
And not talking about things that are the sum of the average of everything that's gone before, but where things are going, how to think about things.
My hair is AI generated, though. I usually have a huge ponytail, and but for this conversation, we switched on the sort of, cul-de-sac look.
Well, I added the gray hair to mine.
Perfect.
So touch all of that up.
Exactly.
But as we wrap up here, somebody's thinking about either taking their podcast to the next level, right? Or starting a podcast for their brand. What words of advice would you give for them?
I go back to the question of, what is the job of the podcast? What is it meant to be doing? And use that as your North Star for everything that you create moving forward. If you have a question around sort of, how much time and energy should I focus on the background of my YouTube studio, and how much energy should I put into the format of, my interviews, answer the question of, like, what is the job of the podcast? What is this meant to be doing? And then ask yourself, who is it meant to be doing it for? Who is your audience? And talk to your audience. Like, I think a lot of times marketers assume they know everything about their audience, but refuse to actually ask them any questions. Like, we have more ways than ever to talk to people online these days that consist of your audience, then reach out and ask them, like, hey, what would you like to see in a podcast? If we did a podcast, what would you like to learn about, watch, listen to, and create it for them, not for you.
Yeah. Well, Roger, what's ordinary to you is amazing to others. How can people get in touch with you to keep this conversation going?
Yeah, check us out at jarpodcast.com. So that's JAR podcast.com. Also, I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn. I'd love to hang out there. Let's keep the conversation going and reach out if you have any questions.
Excellent. We'll come together again 5 years and see how the predictions are doing.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, Tom.
What I love about the conversation with Roger is how clearly it reinforces something we talk about all the time, that podcast interview marketing isn't about the activity, it's about the outcome. Too many people start a podcast or go on interviews because it feels like the thing that they're supposed to do. But Roger reminds us that the real starting point is asking that simple but powerful question. What job is this podcast supposed to do for our business? Is it building authority, influencing buying decisions, strengthening trust with a specific audience? You see, when you know the job, everything else becomes clearer. The topics you discuss, the shows you appear on, even the stories you tell. And that's especially important today. In a world where AI can generate unlimited content, trust is the real currency. Podcast interviews work so well because someone has already chosen to spend time listening to you. That's attention that you can't buy. So here's your next step. Before that next podcast interview, write down the single job that interview needs to do for your business. Not vanity metrics, but real business impact. You see, when you show up with clarity, every interview becomes more valuable for the host, for the audience, and ultimately for you and your brand.